Hey, Alec Miller here, founder of Rows and Rogues, and today we're going to be hanging things from ropes and wrapping them in ropes and all things rope dynamics in Cinema 4D. Let's go. So if you didn't know, we at Royals and Rogues have been working on a short film, and as we run into problems or solve things or develop new techniques with the short film, I'm going to be making tutorials to share it with you. Also hit subscribe because we go live every Friday or so, and you get to follow along with the production as it happens. So I think it's going to be a fun journey for all of us, but I know why you're here, and that's to learn about the rope dynamics in Cinema 4D. Now, there are a lot of tutorials about dynamics and rope dynamics in Cinema 4D out there. My problem with them is most of them are very abstract. So it's really easy to use Cinema 4D's tools and simulations if you're making something kind of vague and abstract that just kind of needs to wiggle wobble around, sort of shoe commercial style. But once you start trying to get something specific, once you're trying to do something kind of practical and useful, things get a little wonky and break down, and I'm going to be covering all that in this tutorial today. So without further ado, let's get started. This is more or less what we're going to be creating. We have a very complex kind of simulation here, right? We have a rope wrapped around something hanging from a rope, as well as a secondary movement of the jaw here. So first, let's start a new project. So I'm not cheating. We're going to start from scratch. Now I'm going to use this ram skull. It's pretty easily accessible from Quixel Bridge, I believe. So you can get this. You'll recognize this in games. I was playing Alan Wake recently, actually, and I saw this on a shelf. So it's a pretty common Unreal / Quixel element. So now we have our ram skull. Let's grab a jaw as well for it and bring it in. Kind of just position it generally where we want it. So for now, I don't really want to worry about the jaw, so I'm going to turn that off. So this is going to be really, really straightforward. First, all we have to do is go to Simulation Tags and then Collider. And now our ram skull is a collider body. Next, I've made this rope round preset, which I'll share with you guys. But more or less, if we wanted to build it from scratch, it's also very simple. It is two end sides that we've duplicated that are sweeped around each other. Obviously, you need to make them smaller. And this one has a few sides here, probably like 20, 30 is probably enough for what we're going to be doing, because we can smooth this out later. And then we very simply just put a simulation rope tag on that and hit play. And that's good to go. It's already working. What we can then do is rotate this around, get it into position how we want it. Let's change the scale of this guy and move it into a position that makes sense for what we're going to do. And pretty much that's it. That's pretty much this first half of this whole tutorial. Once you kind of get it in a good position for wrapping around your subject here, you can go to the rope tag, and then the target length, you can drop that down. And then hit play, and there you have it. Boom. Rope. Done. And we can grab a duplicate of it if we want. So I'm going to duplicate the whole system. I'm going to rotate it around and put it in place. There we go. Let's see, it might be, you want to avoid intersecting when possible with the model, because you're going to get weird issues. So just try to be careful about that. And now if I hit play, they'll both suction on exactly the way I want. So now we kind of have this cool little rope set up here. You could go further like I did and add like a little ring and hold that ring up, but this will be good enough for what we're doing. So now that we have it where we like it, we actually want to remove our rope tags. So what we're going to do is select our sweep object and you know, get it the size we want. You know, let's say we want this like 0.5 maybe, here and here. And that's still looking pretty good. One of the things you might want to look at just to keep in mind is in your rope tag, you want to keep in mind the radius. So it happens to be the radius is already 0.5. And so you'll notice that those are kind of interacting the way we want. If the radius was more than 0.5, then these things would have some floating space between them. So you want your radius to be the same size as your top sweeped end gun, or in this case, end side, I should say. So now that we have that, it's pretty easy. All we have to do is make these editable. So we can connect and delete is what I'm going to do on both of these. And now we can add a cloth surface and make this a child of it. There we go. There we go. Okay. So that lets us kind of smooth these out as needed, and do whatever we need, whatever we want. Right? We can change the thickness. All right. So now that that's done and we have those the way we want, let's make a null object. We'll make these guys a child of the null, and we'll make the ram skull and jaw a child of the null. So now we have this all in one little nice package. All right, now let's hang this from a rope, and this is where it gets tricky. We're going to start by, again, having an end side, and then we also want we're just going to turn this guy off for now. We're also going to want a spline. I'm going to go into one of our other views here just to make this easy, and click twice. It doesn't have to be perfectly aligned, and then hit exit, because we're going to simulate it anyway. It's going to wobble around, so it doesn't really matter if this is completely totally straight. All right, so now we have our nice little spline, and we have an end side. As you notice, the end side is way too big. We're going to shrink it down something reasonable. I'm probably going to make like 3 centimeters, and we're going to keep it at 6 sides for now, and we're going to turn the intermediate points to none for now. On our spline, we're going to change the intermediate points to uniform, and you'll see why in a second. And for now, I'm going to do 0. Okay, like before, all we need to do now is add a sweep. If you hold down Alt when selecting, you'll automatically make whatever it is you have selected in your object manager here a child of the new object that you created while holding down Alt. We're also going to remove this collider from the ram skull for now, because we don't want it interacting with our new rope that we're about to create. So then go to the spline and then select rope. And again, there we have it. Now we have a new rope. Now the problem with this rope is it's just going to fall down, right? And it's going to act like a stick. So we need to do a couple things. First thing I'm going to do is under simulate forces, I'm going to go to wind. We're going to up the speed to like 200 and the turbulence to 70. That's just so it shows up. All right, so now it gets pushed by the wind, but it's still acting like a stick. So our problem is we don't have 2 things. One is we don't have intermediary points, and 2 is there's nothing holding this in place. So what we need to do is click our spline, go to the points selection, select the top point, go back to our tag, and under display anchors, under anchors here, we just hit set. And what we're telling it is this should now be an anchor, that point that we had selected. And now if we hit play, what we should see is it's now hanging. So that's perfect, but it's still acting like a stick. And that's because we don't have enough intermediary points. So we want to up this. If I add 1, I can add 2, and I can take this all the way to probably like 12. And now it's acting more rope-like. So that's great. Hey, I just realized I need to advertise this at the beginning of the tutorial because you're going to skip it. But there's this huge issue with ropes in Cinema 4D that I want to point out at the beginning so you don't miss it. But you'll notice it rotates around the axis. We get to that at the end of the tutorial, so stick around for that. So we have a rope acting rope-like. Now we need to attach something to it. Now, what I recommend doing, you could go and just attach the ram skull directly to it if you're a brave soul. That's likely going to cause problems. It's likely not going to sit exactly where you want it to sit because this simulation, no simulation, but in particular, these ones aren't crazy accurate. There's always going to be a little bit of like lag time. I just shrunk the size of our rope there so it lined up kind of with the size of the ones wrapped around the skull. That's a really long rope, but it should work fine. You could connect it directly to the skull, but I don't recommend doing that. What I would do is create a cage object is what I would call it, or a placeholder. So we can just create like a cube, make that cube roughly the same size as your object inside of the cube. And this is going to run the simulation way faster and be less likely to break apart. So I'm going to kind of get this in this right spot that I want to be about the same size, and then it should be approximately kind of the same weight that way. Why I'm doing this is there's a secondary step that I want to do with the jaw, and that really breaks apart if you're simulating the skull itself. So we're going to make this little cage using a cube. We're going to add some segments to it, just like 5 by 5 by 5, and then we're going to make that editable. Okay, so now we have our cage, and we're gonna name this skull just to keep organized, because you guys always label everything and stay organized, right? And we're gonna move it approximately right underneath our rope here. So we kind of want it somewhat centered. That's pretty good. And we're going to add a rigid body. And so now this is seeing this as a rigid body. And if I hit play, what we'll see here is nothing happens. It just instantly flies out of frame. And that's because these aren't connected. So what we need to do next is add a connector object. So we're going to take our cube, make sure it's lined up pretty well, but maybe not touching exactly the rope. And we're going to add a simulation tag connector. From here, we can change our search radius, but we're not seeing anything. And that's because we have to create the connection, but we can also hit update live. And if we click that, as I expand the search radius, you'll see it draws that little connector. And that means we're connected. Max connections is what it sounds like. How many connections can you make with one from like a point to another point? And then the other thing you're going to want to look at is the point restriction. So it shouldn't be a problem for us because we can kind of control the distance and the number of connections. But if I had many points here and I was worried about them over connecting, what I could do is go to our spline, go to point again, select the bottom point here, and let's go to lines just so we can make sure that we have it selected. And then I could hit select, store selection. And then if you'll notice in that connector tab, there's this little icon. It matches up with that icon. We could drag it in there, and now it's only going to connect to that one point. So that's all good. I like the update live just because it's easier to see, you know, exactly how far I need to go. Now there's a few settings to go over before I go any further, and that's to make this stuff all run good, more or less. So we're gonna hit play, and we'll probably notice a little weirdness happening. So the first weirdness I notice is when I hit play, it sort of sinks and then bounces, and then it plays out the rest of it. And if I turn off our wind, it might be more apparent. So we have that kind of sinky bounciness where it's not staying the same length as it should, right? And you control all that using your scene attributes. So you hit Control D and you can go to your project settings, your project attributes. You can also go to Edit, Project Settings, and you can do substeps. And that's going to be your number one tool. So its default is 20. If you up it to 40 and hit play, you'll notice it syncs a little bit less. If I did it like 120, it's going to get slower every time, but it's going to get more accurate. So you notice it didn't bounce like really at all there. And that's because we're increasing the accuracy, but sacrificing speed. So that will help out that. Iterations also helps, smoothing iteration helps, and then dampening is sort of how fast is the physics happening. Let's slow down. We're kind of putting it underwater a little bit. So right now it's at full speed, and you'll notice it kind of takes off right away, but if I turn the dampening up to like 30, it's gonna slow it way down. And so that helps out a lot if things are flying all over the place. Same with velocity clamp, you're just restricting how fast it's allowed to move. I typically keep the dampening around like 5-10%. By default, it's like 2. I wouldn't go below that. Weird things happen. So it doesn't seem to be an issue, but one of the things to keep an eye out on is the scale, like I said earlier, with making your rope the same size as your end side, and making sure that it's not going to be too big. And what can happen is if you have two things close together like this, if I were to move this cage up, let's say, go back to object mode, and it intersects or gets close to intersecting, and now I hit play, you'll notice this goes all over the place. And so what you want to do is make sure they're just not intersecting, and then check out your collision thickness. And that's how thick the shell kind of around this that it's calculating. So you want to make that, like, we can make that pretty small. We can make that 0.1 if we want. And now if I hit play, looks like we're still a little bit. Let's move this down just a tiny bit. You'll notice that we can get that much nicer, where it's not freaking out. The other thing to look at is collision shapes. Now we have a cube, so our collision shape is going to be a cube. But in order to see this, we want to hit Control D again, go to our project settings, go to simulation, and then underneath draw, just turn on more or less everything, but especially collision radius, and your rigid body shapes. These are going to show you all the shapes. Now you notice nothing happened, and that's because it hasn't really figured out what the shape is yet until I hit one frame in. And then there you can see those red lines, that's our shape. That's the center of our shape. And you'll even notice all the joints in our rope also show up now. So what this allows us to do is control what this shape would be. So if we weren't using a square, we could choose a different shape. But even though we are using a square, we can use a sphere, let's say. And now if I go back and step one frame forward, you can see it's calculating our collision as a sphere. So this is really useful if you don't want to use like a literal, if you wanted to have a bunch of things rolling around, but you didn't want to do all the calculations of making your shape exactly correct, right? Now you can make it correct by using a triangle mesh. And again, if I go back and then forward, you'll see it creates a triangle mesh of my shape. And this would do the same thing for any other object you have. You can also choose convex holes, which works very well. It's going to more or less look like my same auto/box, because it's a pretty easy shape. And if I go to box, obviously it makes it a box. But what's cool about this is I could take my ram, put this on the ram skull, and calculate it out as a box, right? And that's going to really lower the amount of time it takes to calculate. In my case, there's a very particular reason I don't want to do that, and I'm going to get into that now. Okay, so now that we kind of have the simulation working the way we want, I'm going to make the skull a child of our cage, and then I'm going to turn it, I'm going to force it to render that. So now I've hit play, we have this, and now you can kind of see why we wanted to do this. Is nothing's really sitting where it should be, but that means that I can just simply raise this up and kind of guesstimate it into place. And that allows you to have a lot more art, direction and control versus relying on the simulation to be super duper accurate. So you can have a somewhat inaccurate, with a little bit of gaps, a little bit of distance between simulation, which then has a more accurate positioning by doing it manually. So that's something to keep in mind, like kind of all the time. All right, I think I also want to turn off the wind after a few frames. So in our wind, we're going to have the wind speed be full speed. I'm going to move up that first frame to 16 frames. And then we're going to drop the wind speed down to 0 and add a keyframe. And now it goes and then stops. And so we sort of get this nice little swing movement. Let's up the number of frames in our scene to 300. And that gives us a bit more time to play with this. So there we go. Now we have our skull, it's wrapped in ropes, and it's hanging. Now is where we get into some of the technical limitations and problems that I've ran into with Cinema 4D and its ropes. All right, well, we crashed and I had to recreate this entire simulation. I did drop the wind speed down a bit because it was acting a little too crazy for me. But let's recover from this crash and pick up where we left off. So we're about to do the add in the jaw and make that work. So the first thing I'd recommend doing is, if we just add it now, we're gonna have two simulations running at the same time. We're gonna have one simulation that is our rope sim, and then the other one is gonna be the jaw sim. And I don't recommend doing that. What I recommend doing is caching this rope sim first, and then doing the jaw sim second. And so, you know, right now we have this whole thing, it plays out as it should. And that's great, but the only problem is we don't want both of those running because they're two different sims, right? One's a bullet physics and the other one is the new unified physics system. So first things first is we're gonna cache this original one. We're gonna cache the scene, which will cache both of these. All right, so now that those are both cached, we can actually scrub in our timeline, holding down J and clicking in the viewport lets us do that, or we can just grab the little timeline marker and we can see it all plays out exactly the way we want. So that's really cool. So now that we have that working, let's get this jaw going, the secondary animation. And this could be useful for all sorts of things, right? Like not just a jaw, but you know, if you have something hanging and then there's something else attached to that thing, isn't exactly uncommon. So in order to get this working, it's gonna be a little bit more involved. So we need to go up to simulate and then bullet, and we're gonna choose a connector. And that's gonna allow us to connect two things together. So let's scale that down. The other thing, other than scale, you could also just go to display and then change this. And right now, if I click off it, it goes away. If you wanna see it, you can hit always visible. So we're gonna move it down to where it needs to be in the jaw. And then we are going to change the draw size to make it much smaller. And we are going to rotate it. And this is exactly what we want, which is a hinge. Okay, so now this is gonna work like a hinge joint, exactly as you would expect it to and want it to. All right, now that we got it in place, we need to connect these two objects, the jaw and the skull. So what we're gonna do is, in our connector here, object, we're gonna choose the skull as the A object and the B object will be the jaw. So far so good. Looks like it's all working. If you notice, if we hit play, it all breaks and nothing really happens. And that's because neither of these are physics objects yet, and they need to be. So if the skull, we're gonna go to our bullet tags, because remember, this system only works with bullets so far. I'm hoping they update this soon, but as of right now, it only works with bullet. So we're gonna make this into a collider body, and the jaw, we're gonna make into a rigid body. And now that we've done that, if we hit play, this should all work. There it is, all working magically. Now, if you notice, the jaw's swinging all over the damn place, and there's a few reasons for that. In our connector, what we want to do is go from X of object to direction to object underneath the reference axis. And then same thing here, direction to object. And what that's going to do is make this more what this is rotating around and what it's referencing. Okay, so now that we have the direction to object set, we're going to need to set an angle limit. It's going to look different depending on your object, but you're going to want to set that here. And if I play on us right away, it's stopping where we want it to stop and not going as far as we need it to stop. But you're going to have to play with this, and it's within this little pizza wedge. So whatever that little pizza wedge is, that's where your object's going to be able to move. Now, if you notice, it's flying backwards right away. And I believe that's because while it's not exactly one unified system, like these can't interact with these, the effectors, the simulation forces, affect both. So the wind currently is affecting our jaw, and we don't want that. So because this is all already simulated, we can just turn off wind. Or if we had this all active, we go to forces and drop wind in there as an exception. But for now, we're just going to turn it off, and now let's hit play and see what happens. All right, so now that we have this all playing back the way we want, it's this nice fun little jaw here moving around. What we can do is Control D again, go to our bullet tag, go to our cache, and then we're gonna bake this whole thing. And so we hit bake, it bakes super fast, and look at that. Now everything's working out the way it should, and we can scrub our timeline. So one last trick I've noticed. You might not have seen this as we've been playing through this whole video, but there's actually an issue with the rope object. And what happens is, it's hard to see if it's not textured, but what you'll notice is if this thing's textured, this rope is actually spinning around on its axis. So how do we fix this rotating issue? It's moving all around. Well, it's a little complicated, unfortunately. There's two options. One, I haven't been able to really get to work, and that's creating another spline and then using Espresso to convert all of the points from one to the other so they're in the exact same positions and move the exact same way. If you're an Espresso expert, you can try that. What I'm doing is going to turn this into an alembic. I'm going to hit bake as alembic, not bake and delete. I just want to bake it as its own alembic. And if you notice, we just made everything worse. And essentially what we've done is cloned this spline, this cached spline. It is its own shape. And now we are going to go to our sweep and tell it to look at this as a rail. So right now we have use rail direction, to rail, and rail scale. We want to turn off use rail scale. And we want to offset this because right now, if you notice, it's all flat, and that's because they're in the exact same position. So I move this over though, you'll see that now it's the correct shape again. So just move this over away from your initial shape far enough, and that will fix that rotating problem. So now if I hit play, it's staying in the direction it should stay in. And what happens essentially is it doesn't know what to reference, which the sweep doesn't know which way to face. It sees this as just a line, but as it moves past its axis, it freaks out and decides to rewrite the way it's sweeping. So that's why you need this rail to say, hey, point it that way. Point it towards this other thing that's the same height, the same length, and moves in the same way as this one. That will fix that problem. If you're still getting some minor issues, which you'll notice, your Fong might be an issue. So if I scroll through this here, there might be a time where you get like a little glitchy. It doesn't look like I'm triggering it with our rope, which is great. But if I move into like this section here, what you might notice is some weird issues with your shading. And that's where your Fong angle is gonna help. So that's gonna smooth out those ridges. You can also, it's still live, you can also still add more sides. So that's kind of cool about this is, you know, it's still non-destructive even though it's all cached. The only step you're going to have to remember is if you want to change the rope at this point in the simulation, you're going to have to disable, get rid of your alembic, and then rerun the sim and then clone your alembic again. It's a little bit of a pain, I understand, but to be honest, it's sort of the last step anyway, and at this phase you shouldn't really be changing too much. And really at some point you kind of want to make this whole thing an alembic, so that way if you know you're not worried about losing your cache files, you're not worried, you know, save your original project, but then turn this whole thing into alembic, and then from there you can clone it, you can do whatever you want with it. So there you have it. That's how to make a complex rope simulation that's practical. It's not just a bunch of ropes snaking or noodling in a pile. It's interacting with multiple systems. You have multiple different types of ropes going on, all playing neatly together and not crashing. And also working, you know, more or less real time. So kudos to Cinema 4D for building this awesome rope system that works so well, even if I can make it crash by doing silly things. But also, I hope to see the unified system work with connectors someday soon. Maybe next update, we can finally have a fully unified system. Okay, so there you have it. That's how to make complex practical rope simulations in Cinema 4D. If this helped you out, if you found value in this, please hit subscribe. It would really mean a lot to me. But also check out our production. We've been using all sorts of tools and techniques, and this is one example of breaking down a system that we used for our short film. And I really hope that you'll enjoy the rest of our content as well. Knowing what buttons to push is important, and it's a valuable part of being a filmmaker or 3D artist. However, knowing why you're doing what you're doing, figuring out what it means to the audience and what the bigger picture is, I think is equally, if not more, important. There are all sorts of technically not that impressive films that we love and cherish to this day, even if they're outdated, because of the ideas and the story and the why behind the effects. So stick around for more of that content. I'm Alec Miller, founder of Royals and Rogues, and I'll see you in the next one.